In this brief session, we're going to be looking at some basics of online learning, particularly some of the basics of design. So let's start off first with some of the things that we need to put into our online courses. One of the things that's often put into an online course are recordings of lectures. So it's relatively straightforward in many institutions to record your lectures and have them put online. But there's always some issues with that, and if you have a particular issue that you'd like to raise, you can put that in the discussion board on recording lectures. E-marking's another essential component of many online learning systems, and it's reasonable to assume that any student submission which is submitted electronically should be marked and provided with feedback electronically. But as with everything else, some things do get in the way of this occurring, and there's a discussion board for us to discuss that as well. It's often not in the submission side. It's possible to submit just about anything we can imagine online in some way or another. There's different file formats that we'd have to worry about, but it's definitely challenging for some things to be submitted and then actually marked online as well. So in the discussion board you could discuss those as well if you wished. If we get down now to curriculum, I like to think of curriculum using Marsh's brief description of an interrelated set of plans and experiences which a student completes under the guidance of a school. I like to add, designed with a defined and well-executed strategy and to meet the goals of the student, the school and the community. But nonetheless, that is the essential elements of a curriculum. We don't usually get the chance to do too much curriculum design. That's something that's usually left to many other people. But on a day-to-day basis, we're used to looking at courses, interpreting courses, making changes to courses, and on very lucky occasions, we get the opportunity to actually design courses from scratch. When we're designing courses from scratch, we need to know where it fits within the curriculum. We need to kind of understand where the curriculums come from in the first place. One of the things from UNESCO's site is that they have a framework for curriculum design. Consider the current context that you're working within, any educational policies which are relevant to you. Think about the learning objectives for each cycle of the program, first year, second year, third year. Define the structure of your education system to deliver that learning. Structure your content. Make sure that you have thought of the resources that you need and can actually access them. Think about how you're going to teach this, and think about, in particular, how you assess achievement in that area. So designing curriculum, we might choose to scaffold the whole thing. We look at some analysis. Is there a need for a particular curriculum or an element of the curriculum? In this case, an element of the curriculum for us is often courses. Consult with, find people that might be interested in the course element you're designing or the curriculum that you're working on. Gather as many voices as you can to contribute to the design of it. It's much easier to cover many different aspects if we don't try and do all this stuff on our own. Okay, define what the curriculum is meant to deliver on the course level, define what the course is meant to deliver, how it fits in with the curriculum, and then start designing. Develop your learning outcomes, think about how you're going to provide the educational content. That includes assessment, activities, various interactions that might occur. Think about the logistics of it, how you're going to implement it. In most institutions that you're likely to be seeing, there's a learning management system which will form part of the implementation for you. And then think about an evaluation plan. Often we forget it because we're so stretched for time, but it's always worth considering. And then implement, and then evaluate. You may wish to use something which will help lay things out for you so that it's all relatively clear. So in this case, you might decide to split your curriculum up by years, think about all the courses or the learning objectives from those courses that might fit into each year, and start to form a picture of how everything fits together. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to look at here is the ADDIE process. It's relatively straightforward, and in fact we've just run through it there in that curriculum/course discussion we've just had. The ADDIE stands for Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation and Evaluation. On the website there's some nice little YouTube videos about ADDIE, and it's definitely worth you having a look at those. It makes things quite clear about what fits into where. And your mileage will vary on where you decide to do some things. Okay, let's consider we're starting a course. Let's define what the goals of the course are. Where does it fit into the program that it's going to be servicing? Are there any benchmarking things you need to do? Is it being taught in other courses? Some of the content that you're thinking of? Is it at the right level? So have a look at the courses at each level. Are there other courses around in other institutions which may give you some guidelines as to what might be relevant within the current marketplace? And is there a market? Is your course going to bring in new students? Is it going to provide new learning opportunities for existing students? All these things need to be considered. At the end of it, identify your learning objectives, your learning outcomes. This is critical. It's not worth getting into the design phase until you actually understand what it is you're going to teach and can articulate it clearly. So what are learning outcomes? Basically, they define the learning and assessment goals for your students. They are the key, the linchpin, if you will, of your courses. And they will help define the parameters of your teaching. One of the issues that we all have with online teaching is this concept of content bloat. It happens within our face-to-face teaching too. We just try and pack in a lot of stuff, maybe too much. But within the online realm, it becomes much more difficult to constrain ourselves. One of the ways we constrain ourselves is actually explicitly work with the learning objectives and learning outcomes, and they will define our boundaries. So for a learning outcome, it's relatively straightforward, and any course outlines that exist in your university's systems likely to have learning outcomes built into them already. But let's assume that we're designing a new course, we want to design new learning outcomes, and we're going to use this sort of strategy. An action verb, plan, use, show, interpret, develop, some criteria for performance. So basically the task that the student is required to do. And it might be something like develop, the verb, a program to sort random numbers. That's the criteria for performance. And then we might also add in the conditions that the student will do the task under. After reading the module on error analysis, develop a program to calculate the errors in a particular situation. Learning objectives and learning outcomes. There is a difference and it's relatively straightforward. Let's consider a goal in an English course, which is to introduce students to modes of satiric writing in the 18th century. That's our goal. We might phrase that as an objective to familiarise students with a number of substantive 18th century texts. Students will be trained in the close reading of language and its relation to literary form. That defines what we're going to be doing as teachers. That's the objective. From the student perspective, however, it's quite different. Students should be able to analyse the relationship between the language of satire to literary form by the close examination of a selected number of 18th century texts in a written essay. So we've defined what it is the students actually have to be able to do, and that will help us when it comes to defining the assessments later on. It's much easier for the students. They understand what's going on. If they have to try and interpret learning objectives, it's not really clear for them as easily exactly what it is that they're meant to be achieving out of the course. Objectives for us, outcomes for students. And there's a nice little reference there from Hardin. If you want to investigate more about learning outcomes, instructional objectives, there is a difference, and it's explained quite well in that paper. So where does it all fit? It's the key point. It's a square, its objectives and outcomes sit there. Everything else feeds into it. The methods for teaching those objectives leading to the learning outcomes for the students, and the assessment is the tool that provides the link between those things. So the assessment will determine whether our methods have appropriately taught the students to achieve the learning outcomes. The design stage is effectively a storyboarding exercise at this point here. You lay your plans basically for accomplishing all of the learning outcomes that you have defined. And it definitely includes assessment at this stage. The odds are that by the time you get to this stage, you already have a pretty good idea about what it is that you want to teach, what the content is likely to be. You haven't probably defined it in any sophisticated or detailed way at this stage, but you probably know roughly what you're going to do. And this is the time when you should be thinking about assessment. Make sure that your assessments line up with your learning outcomes, and then build your content to address the needs of the students who have to complete those assessments. That doesn't mean you have to drip feed them all the content to answer the assessments, but it does mean you need to structure your content so that they can learn what they need to know and apply in various ways to actually achieve the assessments and therefore achieve the learning outcomes. Okay, at the development stage, this is basically where we start creating all the bits and pieces, need to make sure the design works. So you might be creating handouts, you might be finding journal articles for the students to look at, critically analyse. You might be thinking, I need some videos, I want to do some quizzes. So you start developing all this content. You may at this stage not necessarily be thinking about, I'm going to use articulate storyline in my videos. I might not be using a particular tool to develop the quizzes, but you'll start developing the quizzes. You should have some idea of what technologies you're going to use in advance so that you can at least cater some of the work towards it. But in the end, if your video stands alone or is within an articulate presentation or within some sort of elaborate PDF document or is shown to the students in a lecture theatre, that's an implementation choice. At this stage, you're just developing the content. And implementation, we put it all together. In this case, most likely we'll be putting it into our learning management system, whatever that happens to be. Put it all up, make sure it all works. Check the links, make sure the videos work, make sure that content is not huge in some way that will impair the student's ability to access it. So do the best we can there to make sure that everything that we've designed is actually ready. And make sure that things that we think should be visible to the students are actually visible. And finally, make some idea of thinking about how you're going to evaluate it. It might be that you're just going to use CELTS to determine that, but you might be more focused, you might be more interested in particular outcomes. So things like, did the technology work? You'll know that relatively quickly. If there's problems with that, you can address those on the fly. That is a form of evaluation, and evaluation doesn't have to occur at the end. If there's students having issues on the way, obviously we make the changes that need to be made as we can. Learning outcomes, your assessments will guide you there. How well the students perform in those assessments, how often they access the content that you've set up for them. Do they complete the quizzes? Were the quizzes too hard, too easy? Did they seem to feed into other learning outcomes for other assignments? Lots and lots of things there. Was the content used? We think that our stuff is really valuable. The students are the ones that really count here. If they're not accessing stuff, we've done something wrong, and we can fix that in the evaluation cycle. So this week in our course, our focus is on analysis and some design. So we're having a look at our courses. We're making sure that they are aligned with the program that we have them linked to, and we've got to make sure that our learning outcomes are well articulated. So when we meet face-to-face or when you're online and maybe having some discussion, the learning outcomes need to be well articulated before we can even begin. At that stage, we can start having a look at your course for 2016 online. Look at the design approaches to make it work as best it can. Try and make the courses as consistent as possible from one course to another, just to make this life a bit easier for the students. Consistency is something that students really value. So the next time we meet, either face-to-face or virtually, you should have a design plan of some kind ready for your course.